Welcome to another virtual Excel Academy.
Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are. We're with you today at the Virtual Excel Academy. Today we're excited to present to you Rebecca Sheffield and Mark Richert. Mark Richert is the Executive Director of AER Interim, and Rebecca is an experienced TVI, but what she didn't put on her bio that we should all be so proud of is her work in advocacy. So together, the two of them are going to present to you Know Your Rights, How to Be a Self-Advocacy Superhero. And if you're able to see Rebecca, notice she's got a big superhero logo with the Braille letter S on it. So you go, girl, go superheroes. And we would love to see you be a self-advocacy superhero too. As you roll into our attendance today, let us know who you are and where you're from. And I will introduce our hostesses. Charlotte Cushman is the Paths to Literacy Manager, and she is also from Perkins and Texas School for the Blind. Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Leanne Grillat is the Director of National Outreach Services from American Printing House for the Blind. Hello, Leanne.
Welcome, everyone.
And we also have a closed captionist who's oftentimes behind the scenes, but maybe she'll say hi to us today. Hello, Belinda.
Hello, everyone.
There she is. We're so proud to have her captioning all of our videos. If you see them on the archive, they will be captioned. So thank you, Belinda, for your hard work. Hello, Isabel from Colorado. Hello, Ashley from California. Christina, welcome. Sanaya, glad to have you back. We have so many people coming in to our chat room today. I have one last question for you. If you have attended an IEP, will you press Y or enter yes in the chat room? Have you ever attended an IEP?
And you're asking the students.
We have a lot of yeses. That is wonderful to hear. And Mark and Rebecca will be talking to us about IEP. So I'm so glad to see so many of you have attended an IEP. All right, take it away, Mark. Take it away, Rebecca.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Rebecca, and my friend Mark Richert is here with me. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Rebecca. Hi, everybody.
Hey. So we are here to talk to you a little bit about advocacy, which is actually not a little bit. It's a big deal. And we thought to start off with is to think about how being an advocate is like a superhero. So I would like to introduce myself. My name is Rebecca, and my students call me Dr. Sheffield, but you guys can call me Rebecca. And I am a superhero because I'm a teacher and I teach Braille, and that's my superpower. And I'd like to see, while Mark introduces himself, if you could write what your superpower is and what is the super about you. What would your superpower be if you could be a superhero in like Superman or Wonder Woman? What is your superpower? If you write that in the chat box. And Mark, what is your superpower and what do you do? What is your job?
Well, I am told that my superpower, or the unstoppable superpower, is my mouth. That apparently it just goes and goes and goes, and I can't stop talking. Which hopefully means that along the way people are laughing at things that I've had to say. But yes, I've had the privilege, all joking aside, of having a lot of my career over 25 years or more, having the kind of work that allows me to use my voice and literally and figuratively speaking up for all of us. So that's my superpower.
Awesome. So Mark's superpower is that he can use his voice to speak up for people. He's also pretty funny. And my superpower is I'm a teacher. I teach Braille. I see other people sharing superpowers, helping people to see. So maybe that person is maybe an eye doctor. There is somebody says their superpower is writing. Oh, a teacher who says her superpower is patience. I can understand that. And another person, their superpower is helping families. That's really awesome. So another thing we'd like you to know more about who is on the call is if you're a student, and only if you're a student, would you write what grade level you are going, either what grade level you're in right now, or if you want, you can tell us what grade level you'll be in next school year. You can choose. And if
your
you'll
sound
type that
does
in
in
the,
and out, so stay still.
okay. All right. So students, if you would write your grade level in the chat box so we can see how many students are here and what grade level you're in.
While they're doing that, I wonder, is this the time when I'm supposed to talk about how my very first crush when I was growing up was on my TVI, on my Braille teacher? Maybe I shouldn't talk about that then.
It's kind of funny, actually.
Well, she mentioned Wonder Woman. So, I mean, I have to say that, you know, when you're 12 years old and you have a 20-some-year-old just out of school TVI working with you, it's a little hard not to see them sort of a combination of your mom and Wonder Woman as your TVI. So, you know, it's kind of warped my perspective over the years, I suppose, but I can't help it.
Well, I see a first grade, transition grade 12. I graduated in 2020. I'm in 7th grade. I'm going to college. I graduated from high school last year. 8th grade.
All right. So it looks like we have a good piece of folks, and so we're going to explain some things that you may already know about advocacy, and also talk about some things that you may not know. And to get us started, I want to start off with a really important question, which is, what is advocacy? Mark, could you tell us, what does that word mean? What does it mean to be an advocate?
It means to speak up and defend yourself, or to protect yourself, or to advance yourself, or to protect, advance, or help other people. To be an advocate means that you're pleading a case. It doesn't have to be a technical legal case, but it means standing up for what's right and defending those who might not necessarily be able to help themselves. Anyway, that's my definition. I don't know if everyone else would agree. That's what I think of when I think of advocacy.
Okay, and I'm going to tell something. I hope you don't mind, Mark, but I'm sighted, and Mark is one of my friends who is awesome Braille reader, and he happens to be blind. So what does it mean to be a self-advocate when you're a person who is blind?
Let's see, what does it mean? It means often that you're having to have a lot of patience. Somebody said being patient earlier, having a superpower, because I think people make all kinds of assumptions about every blind person reads Braille, or that every blind person has this or that ability. So I think in my case, it's always trying to emphasize that every person is unique and has different unique needs. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's what I got for you.
I'm going to just mention Sanaya, who wrote into the chat, says she's a graduate in 2020. So congratulations. She's graduating on Friday. And she writes that advocacy is knowing your abilities.
I like it.
I think that is where all advocacy starts, right? Because typically when we're advocating for something, whether I'm a teacher and I'm advocating for my students, or my students are advocating for themselves, first we have to identify something that needs to change. And so an advocate is someone who uses their words and their actions to help make a change, and usually hopefully for good, right? Help to make things better. So some other words that we want to talk about real quick. Rights. Okay, so we all have rights. In the United States, we have some documents and things that outline what our rights are. For example, we have the right to speak up, to use our voice, to say when we like things and to say when we don't like things. We have the right to vote, and we have the right to do different things and be what we be when we grow up and have jobs. Those are all rights that we have, and they're protected by laws. So Mark went to law school, a special kind of graduate school where you study law, you become a lawyer and do lots of things like that. Mark, will you tell us what law is?
What is law? Wow. Law is the written way, the written form of how societies govern themselves, how people get together and govern themselves. And some people have actually said that justice is the use of language in the defense of right causes. So that's a little flamboyant, but I say that only to say, you know, what is the law? If you wanted to point to it, you'd probably be pointing in a book or a computer screen because it's words on a page. But it's really a written statement of how a society wants to govern itself. And so there's laws all over the place. We have laws at the national level, at each individual state level, and even more locally down into the sort of city level, and even sometimes even smaller than that. So there's different levels at which you can have these various statements about how we're going to live and work and play and make money and such together. And all of that is governed by the law.
So I saw a lot of people are here from the United States, and that's pretty much what we're going to be focused on today. Whether in the Puerto Rico or if, like my students who are in the U.S. Virgin Islands, or if you're in any of the 50 states of the United States or any of the territories, we have national laws, which we call our federal laws, and then we have your states are going to have different laws, and we'd have to have 55 different webinars to talk about all of your different state laws. So today we're going to be talking about just the federal law or some national laws and how you can use those and understand those federal laws to help advocate for yourself, advocate for your rights, maybe the rights of your friends, other people. Be a good advocate, because you don't have to be an old person like me. You don't have to be a teacher. You have to have any skills other than to know about your rights and to practice talking about defending your rights and being an advocate for yourself. That's what all it takes. At any age, you can be an advocate. And I see in the chat somebody's asking about they want to see Mark. Well, he doesn't have his camera on today. So you have a nice picture of Mark when he was doing some advocacy on a important law that we're going to talk about here in a second. So the only picture on the screen of Mark is not a video, it's a picture. Okay, so just real quick, some history about how laws about in the United States. Who can name a famous advocate? If you have an idea of advocate for people who are blind or visually impaired, and type that in the chat box. Let's see.
I can. Oh, you didn't mean me. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I couldn't play. Sorry.
Well, let's see. So while they're typing, who's the first person comes to mind? Oh, I see Stevie Wonder and Helen Keller as two advocates. Mark, is that who you were thinking of?
No.
Oh,
I was thinking of you. You're awesome, and you do a really good job. So, and it's the kind of person we would hope would be doing advocacy stuff, someone who's really smart and knows how to do things, how to communicate really well and effectively, and always seemingly in a positive, constructive way. And that's a challenge for a lot of people. Some of us lose our temper, and so it's always good to see people who can do it really well.
Well, our attendees are really smart, Mark. So they've mentioned a lot of Helen Keller. We've got Stevie Wonder, Ray. So let's think about Helen Keller and the time back in the times, you know, more than a century ago when Keller was born. Did you guys know that, like, do you think Helen Keller had an IEP? Type Y if Helen Keller had an IEP, and N if you don't think she had an IEP. And
I know this one.
They're mulling it over. There's an N.
Ooh, teacher.
No. Okay. So Mark, tell us what it was like when, I mean, I know that you weren't alive back then, but tell us what it was like when Helen Keller was in school. How did she get access to to school? Like, what was it? Were most kids going to school? What was going on?
Well, it's kind of a bit of a joke among teachers that work with blind and visually impaired kiddos that Helen Keller was a class size of 1, and that the lady who taught her, Amy Sullivan, had a caseload of 1. And they try to make the point that, look, if you provide one-on-one instruction, then of course anybody can turn out to be as amazing as Helen Keller was. So she did have one-on-one instruction, but then also, went on in her own right to complete college education and went on to be a woman of letters and, obviously very, very talented in a whole host of areas. But I would say a long time ago, it was a real struggle. I think the expectation would have been, even though there were schools for the blind back in those days and kids could be taught there really wasn't much of an expectation that kids with disabilities like Helen Keller's would, on average, be getting any kind of education. They certainly didn't have a right to be educated in any real sense, that's for sure.
And Sanaya, I hope I'm saying your name right. She points out that she had no cane to use. That's very smart. A lot of people didn't know that Helen Keller didn't use a white cane. They hadn't really figured out how to teach the white cane for many years, until many years after Helen Keller finished school. So she didn't use a white cane. She didn't use a dog guide. She did get instruction in Braille, but that wasn't a right that was in the law at that point. In fact, there was no right in our law that said that a student who was blind got to go to school. So in some situations, kids who were blind, their parents could go over to the school and say, okay, we want to be first grade. And the school could say, no, we don't know how to do that. You need to stay home. Or sometimes people didn't even get to live with their families. And it was kind of a sad situation for some people that they didn't get to grow up and have the same opportunities as everybody else just because they happened to be blind, visually impaired. So fortunately, that's not the way it is today. And and the reason it changed is not just because somebody in Washington, D.C. said, what should we do today? Maybe we'll decide to let kids with disabilities go to school. No, that's not how it happened. There was a law passed in 1975 after a lot of advocates, including kids and their parents, talked to their congressmen and said, things need to change, our kids need to go to school. Does anybody know what that law was in 1975? And I will even let teachers respond to this one. Teachers,
I know this
what
one.
law was passed? And except lawyers, people who have a law degree cannot respond to this one.
No, that's not fair.
Oh, but I'm seeing some really smart answers. We have a PL 94-142. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Public Law 94-142. And that's the law that we now know as IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is the law that finally said what the advocates have been asking for. It said kids with disabilities get to go to school and they have access to a free and appropriate public education in the United States, no matter what state you're in. And then all sorts of really cool things are built into that law. And it's going to be pretty much the focus of what we're going to talk about for today, and how to use that law to make sure that the things that you need at school, that they're provided so that you can have the same access to education as everybody else. Okay, so I'm really proud of everybody who knows IDEA is. And if you don't, then by the end of today, you will know what IDEA is, which is our special education law, federal law for all of the United States. So, Mark, there were some other laws, not just about special education, but that have happened after IDEA that we should know about. Can you give us some examples of some other really important laws for people with disabilities?
Sure. So probably the one that it first popped into my head when you asked that question was the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which was signed into law in 1990. And that law does a lot of things, but among the principal things that it does is that it says that people with disabilities cannot be discriminated against when they're looking for a job or once they're in the workplace. It says that state and local governments have to do the right thing and accommodate people with disabilities. And it says that so-called places of public accommodation, so hotels and banks and your restaurant and retail stores, even the ones that are online, need to be accessible to people with disabilities. The law does a lot of other things too, including for our friends in the deafness and hard of hearing world, making sure that they have access to telecommunications and that whole ability to make phone calls and chat with folks just like anybody else would. And so the law is pretty comprehensive, but it's an amazing piece of legislation and is really built on civil rights legislation for people with disabilities that had been on the books for some time, right around the same time, roughly speaking, that our special ed law was enacted for the first time in the mid 1970s. Not too long thereafter, we had something on the books called Section 504. And Section 504 is not the address, for your local Starbucks. That's a section of the law. It's a section of the Rehabilitation Act that basically says if you're getting any kind of federal dollars of any kind of money from the federal government, that you have an obligation to not discriminate against people with disabilities and to provide accommodations for them. So the ADA really builds on that. Those are just two examples.
Yep. And Charlie wrote in the comments, the ADA applies on the bus, right? So if you are not a person who drives and you need access to transportation, having access to paratransit and accessibility in the transit system is really important.
Exactly. Yep.
So Mark, because you were involved in a really important and awesome law that was passed not too long ago. Could you tell us about the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act and how you got to be involved as an advocate to make that happen?
Oh, sure. So the Communications and Video Accessibility Act, it's such a mouthful that we just use the initials CVAA to summarize it. And I had the privilege of working on that when I was serving as the public policy director with the American Foundation for the Blind. And those were happy and hardworking days. But that law, that CVAA, again, it's a very comprehensive piece of legislation. It does a whole lot of stuff. So if you are talking about how a mobile phone, like your smartphone, how accessible is that phone anyhow? iPhones have been accessible for a very long time, but not a lot of other phones were. And so over the course of time, that law has ensured that those kinds of technologies are accessible to folks with disabilities. The law is also there to say that if you are deafblind and you're in a low income category, that you are entitled to get your hands on some pretty expensive but very cool technology that helps you communicate with the world. So that's another piece of it. The law talks about making sure that digital television technologies are accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. So any kind of gizmo that's displaying television or video programming of some type or other is likely covered by the CVAA. And a really popular thing that a lot of us in the blindness and vision impairment world are excited about is that the CVAA requires a certain amount of such programming to be audio described. And if you don't know what audio description is, you got to check it out because it's pretty cool. It's basically a way to hear what's going on the screen, anything that's visually going on the screen. And boy, it took a lot for us to get that language in to require that audio description. But now, if you can turn on a television, you are likely to be able to get all kinds of access to audio described programming.
Very cool. So if in the chat box, type a Y or type type the name of your audio described film or TV show. If you've seen something or listened to something audio described, a movie or a TV show, you can just type a Y, or you can tell us the name of the show or movie that you've seen that's audio described. And so
Dr.
we can
S, I
share
don't
those.
know if I want to tell people which one I like best. I'm a little shy about it.
You don't have to.
Okay.
We're just get a Y from. You have definitely checked out some audio described movies. Oh, Cars 2. And
That's awesome.
we're getting
That's
several Ys. I've seen Cars 3 audio described. I didn't see Cars 2. Wizard of Oz audio described. Very cool. So we have Mark and all the advocates for the CVAA thank for this audio description, because now it's in the law to encourage those people who make movies to make sure that it's audio described. Our friends in Canada have a different law, and in some ways they get different and maybe more access in some ways to audio description on some of their shows. So different countries have different laws, and ours is the CVAA with respect to adding that audio description. So,
Hey, Rebecca.
So pretty cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I nerd out for just a second? Because when you just said a moment ago about movies, so movies are required to be audio described under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm not trying to correct you in front of all of these cool students as much as I want to point out for nerdy policy purposes, because I think it's important. You know, so many times people will say, you know, gosh, I would have thought that this would have been taken care of years ago, whatever the problem is, whether it's transportation or something about technology or something about education. People would say, haven't we passed a law about that? Shouldn't that have been fixed years ago? And the way that our system works at the federal level as well as at the state and local level, you really have to solve individual problems. I don't necessarily want to say one at a time, but incrementally, just, you know, step by tiny step. And as frustrating as that is, that's the way we would want it to be, because in a society like ours, where we value freedom and we value liberty and we want to protect everyone's rights, it's important that we don't have very sort of sweeping changes that happen and that just sort of knock all the dominoes down or whatever at one time. So it sometimes can be very frustrating when we say, well, gee, why isn't this working or that working? It's because you have to pass specific laws for specific things. And the CVAA applies to television, and it's very specific to doing that because it went through a specific federal agency called the Federal Communications Commission. But the Americans with Disabilities Act is what we had to use to get movie theaters to provide description of their movies. And of course, those two things help each other, right? So as the movies are produced and movie theaters are required to provide audio description, that means that there's more content for the folks who have TV networks to put up and have audio described so that they can meet their obligations. Anyway, I couldn't resist the temptation to be a nerd for a bit.
No, I really appreciate that, because I think that makes an important point that relates to our special education law, because our special education law is specific to our schools and up to you're 21 or 22 years old and while you're still in school. And then once you're out of school, the special education law doesn't apply anymore. Just like the ADA helps us with movies, but maybe not with TV, the IDEA law is going to help us with school, but it's not going to help us so much with colleges and universities. And so then we have to go back to the ADA for some of those laws. And all of these laws have to work together, and we have to know about several different laws, really be good advocates. So, so now we're going to talk more specifically about IDEA. And oh, and I wanted to share, we had Peppa Pig and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Age of Ultron as additional audio described content that you guys might want to check out. So,
Cool.
so when we talk about IDEA, some vocabulary that you might want to know, special education. So when we talk about special education, that is the whole set of services. It's not any one particular place at your school. Oh, that's the special education room. No, that's not what we're talking about. Special education, it doesn't mean a certain teacher. That's the special education teacher. No, special education is the whole program of things that are available to kids with disabilities. And so why do we say special? Well, maybe we could call it something else. We could call it super education, because it gives you superpowers for advocating. In the United States, we call it special education. In other countries, maybe they special educational needs. They say students with exceptionalities. There's lots of different words. So maybe if you guys don't like the term special education, and you can, as advocates, you can fix it in the future. But that's what we use right now to talk about our students with disabilities. Okay. Individualized. So let's think about the word individualized. What do you think that means to you, Mr. Richert or Mark?
Oh, see, now I wasn't going to volunteer. I was going to speak up and say, oh, I know this one. And then you call on me. There you go. It means people are treated they're treated individually is what it means. They're treated just by who they are, that their specific needs and their characteristics, who they are, those are the things that drive how people treat you, so that it's not a one size fits all for everything, but that every kiddo who is receiving this type of educational service has that service tailored to exactly who they are, what their specific needs are, which are going to differ significantly from me to you.
Right. So our schools, when you go to school, and the school down the block, I'm not talking necessarily about a school for the blind, but there's some things in the classroom that, that work for a lot of kids. And so a lot of kids don't have to have necessarily as much individualized stuff about their education. They walk in, and the things that are in the classroom are generally fit for a lot of the students. But for students with disabilities, sometimes we need things like Braille, sometimes we need things like large print or technology. And so we don't just say, well, every student who is visually impaired or has a disability is going to get a wheelchair. That wouldn't make sense, right? We individualize it based on what students need. So let's start talking about some of the superpowers that are given to you by IDEA. If you have an IEP, or if you have a 504 plan, then it's by the Rehabilitation Act. And so you have some documents and plans and teams of people that help to give you these superpowers. One of them is the right to an IEP team. Raise or put a Y, I'm sorry, in the box if you have ever been to an IEP meeting. And this is just the students this time. If you've been to an IEP meeting, put a Y in the box.
I've been to a bunch.
Sanaya has been, and Mina, and Rita, and Roxanne, and Aisha, and Uriah, and many students.
Yeah, Quilly has many students with them, yeah.
Awesome, and Vivian has, and so lots of students have been to IEP meetings, which is great, because you, as the student, are the #1 person on your IEP team. And so as often as possible, we would love you at those IEP meetings. The other people who are on your IEP team, which is going to help make this individualized education program work for you, are your teachers, your school administrators, your parents are really important members of the team. So you've got, who else? Some people have an orientation and mobility specialist. Some people will have other kinds of teachers, like physical therapist, occupational therapist. You can have other advocates be members of your IEP team. So, so your IEP team is a really important thing, and it's a superpower that you get by being a student with disabilities who's under the law IDEA. Okay. Can you think of another superpower, Mark, that IDEA gives to students who are blind or visually impaired?
Well, access, there is a specific requirement that indicates that kiddos with disabilities are supposed to be included in physical education within the school. In other words, there's really nothing that happens at school that a kid with disabilities couldn't have a right to participate in and have a chance at doing. And the law is pretty clear that you can be involved in all kinds of fun physical ed and other kinds of activities, which is a sensitive point for some of us, since I was naturally a nerd growing up. So I could have used a bit more encouragement doing those kinds of things. But it is there, and it certainly is something that could literally help any student develop their own natural superpowers if they were encouraged to move and to be as physically fit as possible. And so the mere fact that a kiddo has a disability shouldn't hold them back, and the law is pretty clear about that.
So Diapian has a great comment, and which has several pieces to its answer, but the comment is there a law that can help us get extended services such as Braille and O&M services after I turn 22, as I am not getting what I need now under COVID-19 with quarantine? So there's a lot of pieces to that. First, though, she points out that the law does give us access to Braille, which is pretty cool. Like, there's, a lot of this is individualized, and so the law doesn't say, everybody gets this, everybody gets that. But for our field and for students who are blind or visually impaired, we have some pretty cool language in the law that says that we get access to Braille unless the IP team meets and decides that Braille is not appropriate based on an assessment, based on data. So if you are getting Braille instruction in school, type a Y or a big old capital B, whatever, in the comments box to let us know if you're getting Braille instruction at school, then that's one of your superpowers.
I got Braille instruction in school.
Yeah. Awesome.
I did. I had a little bit more vision than I had back in the day than I have now. And so they wanted me to do Braille and low vision related devices and services. So I kind of got the whole ball of wax. So I have no excuse. They gave me all of it.
Awesome. So we have at least 4 of our students responded that they're getting Braille at school. So if your IEP team, and you're a member of your IEP team, so that is to advocate, can meet and talk about making sure that you get the Braille instruction you need, as well as the materials in Braille in your classes. It's not enough just to teach you Braille, but at school, the information in your classes should be provided in an accessible format. And advocates have made a lot of progress in making sure that we have accessible formats. Another accessible format, could be audiobooks. Somebody asked about audiobooks earlier. And so we have laws that help some pretty old laws, in fact, that help create the American Printing House for the Blind and other services where we get Braille and talking books and things like that. And that's part of our federal law. So we can have accessible materials in lots of different formats in our classes. If it weren't for those laws and advocates and lawyers, we wouldn't have that. So that's pretty cool. Oh, and yeah, so Quiley talks about people who might be with low vision and who are told that they can't have instruction in Braille. So what can a student do if they want to have instructional?
Throw
Mark?
a temper tantrum. No, that's the wrong answer. You can,
Can't,
it's a free country. You can throw a temper tantrum, it just won't do any good. But I think the best thing is to work directly with your family or your advocates, whoever it is who is helping you, sit down at the IEP table with your teacher. And if you are blessed to have a teacher, and if you don't have a special ed teacher that knows how to meet your individual needs, certainly the other folks who run the school and all of that, they're expected to sit down at that table, and you need to make your voices heard and say, look, this is what is entitled, or what I'm entitled to. I'm entitled to Braille instruction, and that's what I want. And you have to, we can't always get what we want, but we certainly can make the case. That group, if that group still does not provide Braille based on the needs that that you really want to see fulfilled, then the law outlines a process where you essentially appeal that decision on up the chain. So that's basically what you have to do. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's basically it.
Yep. So the cool thing about IDEA is it puts a system in place that we can advocate. So unlike in Helen Keller's day, when everybody was kind of having on their own and having to fight their own fights and to make things work, we have a system now which has rules in place. There's several questions about transition. So let's talk about transition real quick, because as I said, IDEA only really helps us until we're 21 or 22 years old in the United States. And then when you graduate school. And at that point, then you need to look to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and maybe your college or university or your city or your employer will have to follow the rules of the Americans with Disabilities Act in order to provide you the accommodations. It's a lot harder, but you can still, you're going to learn how to do that while you're in school, to make sure that you ask your college and university or your employer for the accommodations that you need to do your job or to go to school when you're a little bit older. But we transition, so we have a system called transition built into IDEA to help us prepare. So Mark, do you have anything to share about transition for students who are asking about transition?
Sure. And I think, this fits in nicely with the question that was asked a while ago about, what law is there in place to help me get orientation mobility services? So the idea is that once you're out of the special ed system, you're a young person or even an older person, the Rehabilitation Act is there to say we're going to make a good chunk of money available to states to help them provide the kind of training that should be provided with the primary goal really of getting a person a job or helping that person find work. And so while orientation mobility isn't, on its face doesn't necessarily look like an employment skill, right? It's not like learning how to keyboard at a computer or whatever, how to use cool technology. It's obviously absolutely essential. And if you can't get up and get out of your hovel and make your way down to the bus and get to work or whatever, you can't travel on your own, it's going to be very difficult to get a job. So that's what the Rehab Act is about. And the Rehabilitation Act is supposed to work in tandem with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And there's an expectation that the school is working with those state agencies that are paid under the Rehab Act to help students transition from their special education years into the world of independence and work. So that's when people keep talking about transition. It's transitioning from one system to another, as well as from one period in your life and to another, from being a young person and a student in the learning mode to the independent adult person who is perhaps bound for employment and independent living.
So in 1975, when they first created the law that became IDEA, it wasn't perfect, but one of the great improvements that they've made to the law since then is that everybody who's in special education, by the time they turn 16, their Iep team has to have a transition plan. So in addition to the plan for what you're going to do in school every year and how you're going to meet your goals, You also will have a transition plan that talks about how you're going to get the skills you need so that by the time you leave school, you should, you know, if you're going to continue to need orientation and mobility, there's a plan for how you're going to continue to receive that. If you are going to be working with certain technology after you finish school, there's a plan for how you will continue to use that technology. So that planning should be happening as part of your IEP team meetings. And so that's a really important reason you should be there at your IEP meetings. Another important part of the IEP is something called least restrictive environment. That's a mouthful and sounds kind of scary. Mark, can you help me out with that? Least restrictive environment. I don't want to be restricted. What does that mean?
This is one thing about law that can drive people bananas. There are a lot of these phrases that are kind of, you know, when you hear them for the first time, you don't know what exactly they mean. And in some respects, these phrases are meant to be a little obscure, right? They're meant to be specialized in nature. This least restrictive environment is a term that basically, when you unpack it all, basically says kiddos should not be separated from, with disabilities, shouldn't be separated from kids without disabilities, if at all possible. Kiddos with disabilities should be taught in the regular classroom, in the regular school, whenever possible. That's the default. They call it a restrictive environment when that environment is more rigorously walled off, if you will, from other people without disabilities. So the more that that setting is not, quote unquote, integrated with other kids without disabilities or even adults without disabilities, then the law thinks of those settings as restrictive settings. And you can imagine that a use of a term like restrictive or integrated, I mean, these are loaded words. I think you all know what segregation means. No one likes the word segregation. It's an ugly word. It reflects an ugly time in American history, for sure, when people were segregated on the basis of merely the color of their skin. No one wants to be standing up for a segregated system. On the other hand, kids with disabilities and plenty of kids who are blind or visually impaired can benefit from environments that are in fact specifically tailored to their unique needs. And a lot of schools for the blind, for instance, do provide services that might not be, strictly speaking, seen as the least restrictive environment, but are absolutely critical to the development and education of kiddos with vision loss of one type or other. And the big problem that we have in our community is not is making it clear to all of the advocates for special education and the people who really care, as I hope we all do, about protecting students' rights to the least restrictive environment, is that there isn't, again, it's not a one size fits all. Remember that IDEA is all about individualized attention. But secondly, it's critical that we don't think of these things as black and white. In other words, sometimes services are made available at a school for the blind or in an environment that's specifically built for a blind or visually impaired kiddo, but on a temporary basis for a weekend or a short course or a couple weeks. And quite honestly, we blind kids might think that we're having a grand old time at summer camp for the blind, when the truth is they're pumping us full of all kinds of educational content, which we think is just a lot of fun and an excuse to get together. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about that.
Great. So I think Mark is pointing at a really important superpower that we have in our IEP teams, is to look at all the options and figure out not what one size fits all, but what is the environment that is going to help you learn the best and is not going to hold you back or restrict you from the educational opportunities, and at the same time is also the most like what all the other kids in your neighborhood are doing. So that makes it an opportunity opportunity for some kids to go to schools for the blind where that's the best fit for them, and for a lot of kids who go to school at their neighborhood school and receive some services. So your IEP doesn't just say where you're going to go to school, it also says how that school is going to be a good fit for you. And it has things called accommodations, which are ways to give you access to the same instruction as everybody else. And for some kids, there's modifications, and there's actually a change to what is being taught. So that can get a little complicated, but if we're going to have a few minutes to try and answer some questions. So that may be something you have questions about. Your IEP lists your accommodations and modifications, and because IDEA is a law, your IEP, the document that writes it down, is a legal document, so you can really use that as a tool to advocate for the things that you need and that you're looking for.
Hey, Rebecca, one thing I want to make sure we
yeah,
mention, because I think it would be great for people to make note of this, everybody, the students on the call, but also the adults, basically everybody. All of these different things we're talking about, of course, don't come cheaply. Rebecca, you need to put food on the table and help put a roof over your head. And so that somebody has to pay your salary. Somebody has to buy the cool technology that we all need. And indeed that sometimes the costs for services can be a lot, but it's important that you all know as advocates for yourself or for others that at no point is it appropriate at any time for a school to come along or somebody to say, we're not going to, or we can't provide the service you're talking about because it costs too much. Because the law is pretty crystal clear that cost is not a factor that goes into determining whether or not a student gets a specific service or not. Now, I know that there are probably some very well-experienced teachers on the phone, and Rebecca is one of them, who are probably smiling at me as I say that, because we know as a practical matter, budgets are sometimes can be huge barriers. And as this is the real world we live in, and schools are making decisions all the time about how much they're going to spend and what resources they have available. And lots of schools, districts, for example, don't have teachers like Rebecca or other specialized personnel to offer blind and visually impaired kiddos because they haven't invested in those folks. But as a matter of right, and Rebecca was talking about rights at the beginning, just know that as you're pushing for the things that you want, cost is going to be something that is probably going to be talked about behind the scenes with the folks who are trying to comply with what it is that you need. But cost is never to be an issue in providing service. It's never an excuse to not provide a service.
And that is also another really powerful superpower kind of built into IDEA, because people, if it's an appropriate accommodation and it's in your IEP, then the school district can't say, oh, well, we'll save up and maybe we'll buy that in a couple of years. That's not what the law says. And so having good advocacy skills and accessing and understanding the law is really key to using your superpowers. So we're going to, because there's so much, Mark and I could keep talking about this all day, and we know that you have things to do. I am going to be sharing a handout that has lots of really awesome information about your IDEA superpowers. And it has some vocabulary words that we've talked about today that if you don't know what they mean, you might look them up. It has some suggested activities. For example, can you find an accessible copy of your IEP? I know lots of students who are Braille readers who do not have access to a copy of their IEP in Braille or in any sort of electronic format. And so that is probably something we should change. So talk to your teachers, see if you can get a copy of your IEP that you can read yourself. Do you know that last date of your last IEP meeting? Because IEP meetings should be happening at least once a year. Do you know who is on your IEP team? And can you explain what your IEP goals are? That's a whole nother superpower in IDEA, is to have goals written and people working to help you achieve those goals every year. And do you know what your accommodations are? So those are just some of the examples of activities that we suggest in this handout. And then finally, our handout ends with some super sites where you can check out some resources. Like there's an app called the I'm Determined one-pager, where you can make a one-page summary of your IEP that you could, or what you would like to present at your IEP meeting. It's pretty cool. There's organizations like AFB, ACB, and NFB that have opportunities for students to get involved in advocacy. And there's links, other links that we're putting in this handout. So we're going to share that, and with that, I would like to see what questions folks have in the last few minutes of our call today. What questions would you like us to try and answer? We'll focus on the questions from students, but we'll try and answer questions from teachers too as quickly as we can.
You can ask me the easy questions. Ask Rebecca the hard ones.
So and earlier folks were talking about, like, if you didn't get the services that are in your IEP because of COVID-19, that is something that our advocates are really going to have to get together and figure out, how are we going to ask for those services. There are some laws in place and some regulations and rules that different federal departments and maybe your state education departments have said about how those services are going to be provided, but there are protections in IDEA. Schools are not, if the school doors are open online for other students, then you have, the same right to instruction and to everything that's in your IEP when the school is open. There's something called compensatory services, that if a school district doesn't provide what they're supposed to be providing at the time, that parents and advocates and students can ask to have kind of make-up services and extra services the next year to make up for what they didn't get in the past. And that all has to be written into your IEP plan. Looking. Okay.
We do have a few hands raised. Would you like to take some questions from the students?
Let's do it.
Sure.
Okay.
Why don't you call on somebody for us? Thank you.
Okay, Sanaya. Hi, Sanaya.
Hello.
Hi.
For the, was it the IDEA?
Uh-huh.
Is it a way for, like, people with disabilities? Is it a way for us to go to school? Maybe someone to pay for it, or will we have to get like a scholarship for that?
Oh, I see what you're talking about. So it's the IDEA law is all about providing a free and appropriate public education for people of student age, not so much what, it's through high school, the expectation is essentially. So if you're talking about beyond high school, then yes, the Rehabilitation Act can help students have their expenses covered to one degree or another. And it's a process, and sometimes a frustrating one, but ultimately the Rehabilitation Act is there to help students cover some of the, if not all of their costs for education beyond high school. But of course, there's always the stuff available to students generally. If you do really well in school and compete for scholarships and such like that, folks with disabilities can and do regularly succeed like that.
Okay, thank you.
That answers your question.
It did.
There's some great scholarship opportunities. A question in the chat is, if you go to private school, does IDEA still apply, Mark?
It does. It does. It just gets a little tricky as to precisely who is required to do what when, and it gets a little tricky. But the fact that a parent decides to have their child educated in a private school, or perhaps even, like, let's say, a religious school, or educating children at home. Nevertheless, that student has a right to an accessible, free, and appropriate public education. And while we do honor the rights and roles of parents in this country, the civil rights go to the child, and the child is entitled to certain rights. Obviously, when you start talking about having a child receive services, let's say in a religious school or environment, sometimes it gets a little dicey about exactly how to pull that off. But ultimately, as just a matter of civil rights, yes, that child is supposed to receive the overall protections of IDEA, regardless of the environment where the parent may place them.
And we can stick around a little bit longer, but I would like to ask Cheryl to come on and let us know what's coming tomorrow, and then we will see if there's more questions we can answer afterward.
Okay, there's a lot of great questions in that chat window, so stick around after we stop our recording here. But let me just tell you what's happening tomorrow. Leanne will be back with us, and she is going to be doing a wonderful lesson on Slate and Stylus. So please join us tomorrow for that Slate and Stylus activity. Grab your Slate and Styli and be ready for some Braille.
It can also be a light dependent person, and there are paper slate and stylus for you.
Okay.
Cheryl, I think we wanted to tell people that Friday we have a session coming up on Helen Keller, Annie Sullivan, and Laura Bridgman. A number of people had written about Helen Keller as being an advocate, so I just wanted to shout that one out today as well.
All right, thank you.
And just before we end, I'd like to say a thank you to both of you for a wonderful presentation. Great to hear us having our students work for their rights. So I'm so glad that you were able to join us today.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.